Social Inquiry. This course is designed to expose the students to the definitions of different branches of knowledge. Each discipline has evolved in different contexts and traditions, and while each has its distinctive domain, there is a need to understand its interconnections with other disciplines. Political science, as a specific branch of knowledge, is grounded in the study of politics, both at the level of theory as well as in practice. It has acquired and developed its own methodologies and perspectives. We have with us today Professor Gurpreet Mahajan to talk to us on political science and its complementarity with other disciplines. Professor Gurpreet Mahajan teaches in the Center for Political Studies at the School for Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. A renowned scholar of political science, she has published several books, including The Multicultural Path, Issues of Diversity and Discrimination in Democracy, and The Public and the Private, Issues of Democratic Citizenship. Welcome to ILLL, Professor Mahajan.
Welcome, Gurpreet, for coming here, and thank you so much, because this is a course on social inquiry, which is actually getting us into diverse disciplines to understand the disciplines individually in order to actually relate it to the idea of social inquiry. In this case, of course, our focus is on political science, or call it politics. To start with, in fact, I would like to ask you this very basic question. Do you see any difference between politics and political science?
Disciplines have their history, and at a certain stage, a particular way of inquiring into what we call politics took on the specific terms political science, because it was going to be a systematic study modeled on perhaps a framework of scientific inquiry, though that has not always been the case. So the tag science after political is something which is relatively more recent than actually the history of the discipline, because politics has been studied for a very long time. I think in 4th century BC, when Plato first wrote his treatise, and in fact the title of Aristotle's book was Politics. But I think in the history of our own understanding of disciplines and constituting disciplines, there has been a shift to studying any phenomena, social or natural, with a particular methodological orientation. That has been called science. And that's why the term political science has come to be. Today, when people use the term politics and political science separately, they usually have in mind a distinction, something like doing politics and engaging in politics, which we do, by the way, all the time, all of us do.
So would you
and
say that
actually the study of those activities.
So, but the fact that you put it in the slot of, say, as a kind of a science, would that also emphasize the point that it's objective study of politics? Does it bring in the element of course, methodology, but does it also bring in the element of objectivity into it?
Yes, it is meant to bring in the element. The objective is a term we need to qualify a little bit, because we are dealing with human actions, and people act with certain goals, orientations, values in mind. So it's not an objective study which is in that sense value-free, but it's reliable. The information it's gathering, the manner in which generalizations are being constituted, they follow a certain pattern and a framework of inquiry, the results of which are supposed to be reliable, to some extent even replicable. So if somebody else was to undertake a similar inquiry, they should be able to see why you reached the conclusions you did. So in that sense, yes, it does claim to have some degree of objectivity, but this objectivity is not something in which the subject plays no role. But again, the notion of objectivity itself has changed over a long period of time.
Would you say that politics, the idea of politics itself, is in fact a certain kind of orientation that also takes one into biases and prejudices or groupism and so on? But the study of it, the study of politics, in that one would have to get a training of in one sense unlearning those prejudices and orientations. So would you say, as a student of political science, one of the most important elements or features would be to actually get rid of the biases and prejudices? Is that part of the training of a political scientist?
Let me say two things first. There is always a starting point, an interest, which pushes you to study something. So all social inquiry really comes with some prior interests and concerns. In fact, it's these interests which we might then call, following a very famous, more recent philosopher, Gadamer, prejudgments. So what you call prejudgment or a prejudice is actually a judgment which you have made in advance simply because you are part of that entire society or whatever it is, or a part of that society that you are studying. It's unavoidable. And in fact, it gives you a vantage point from which to pose questions, because only because you're engaged, you have certain questions which you wish to ask, inquire about. So it's not something which is a negative bias which you need to do away with. Okay? What we need to be cautious about, and that is, I think, one kind of training in political science, especially when they do methodology and research methods and methods in social science, is really to try and see how you might actually engage and produce results, because you have to inculcate this critical engagement with the opinions or hypotheses that you began with, what you thought you expect to find in society. And actually you have to then learn, how do I go about collecting data in a way that can help me to reach some conclusion about whether what I began with is justified or not justified.
Yeah, so how would you say sociology, a project in sociology, would be different from, say,
Not
a
very
political
in this
science?
particular, at an abstract level of methodological orientation, at present, not very different. I think the methods by which we try to justify and substantiate what we are saying are now common across social sciences. And there are plurality of methods. There are some which actually deny the term and self-consciously refuse to use the word science, or interpret the term science to imply that, look, we are not a kind of science which is like the natural sciences. We are the social sciences.
Should we really start with a very conventional, say, a definition of what is political science?
Okay, now that we are on the subject of social sciences, first I think a word of caution. Definitions in social sciences are indicative of what it might be. They are not exhaustive. And they are also, they give you one entry point into the discipline. So let me say that actually the most common way in which politics or the study of political science has been understood is that it revolves around the study of state, governments and what they do. But this is an element of the study of political science and is by no means exhaustive of what political science is.
What else would there be?
Okay, the idea behind the study of political science really is that whenever we have a group of people who live together, when we have a society, this society has to have some way in which it organizes itself and makes arrangements for decision making. Because you have to exchange ideas, you have to arrive, somebody has to decide, and some groups of people or some mechanism has to be devised for decision making.
Power to this?
Power is central, but I will just come to why I'm not using the word power. But when you're taking decisions, the idea also is that you have to implement decisions. And so you might say, therefore, institutions and all kinds of mechanisms that go into the making of decisions is what political science is interested in. In democracies, this means that you're not interested merely in state and government. You are also interested in all those multiple levels of negotiations that go on in society, as part of which group of people may come together, they may form an association, they may put up demands which they may lobby, they may have pressure groups, whatever. So all those multiple layers of negotiations and collective engagements by which people put forward their demands before governments take them up. They are all part.
Organizational element, after which
There is
negotiation.
There is organization. There are, of course, formal institutions. Then there are these organizations that individuals may have and you should be studying. But you're also looking at the relationship between the individual and the state, individual and these associations. You're looking at what is emerging as a result of decision making. Which demands get taken up? Which laws are formulated? Whose concerns have been taken up, because there are competing claims There are different groups sometimes mobilizing. We had this issue of B.T. Brinjal, for instance, and you found in society deep division between various groups. So groups do come in, and we can't do away with that. But we also see who's putting up what kinds of demands, and which is being taken up. Eventually, when debate occurs, what decisions are taken, and so on and so forth. So that's therefore these levels of negotiations that are going on
And there
all
would
the
be a
time.
variety of political systems then, functioning differently.
Political system is the larger whole, the totality of all this. Okay. Now you may say you can have different forms of government or different kinds of arrangements to perform these different functions of interest, what has been called interest articulation sometime, or demands, negotiation of demands, the actual working out of who takes decisions, how are those decisions taken. So you could have different ways in which, and different groups which may be responsible for taking decisions, whether it's going to be a collective representative body, okay, or a nominated body that does it, or a small group of people. Now just to come to the issue of power. So obviously in some way we may say that governments are involved in taking decisions, or there are individuals and negotiations occur, at the end product of which are decisions, policies, also the enunciation of law. Okay, so state or government in that sense, decision-making bodies, are really the repository of what we might call political power. Okay, but in democracy we are also very concerned, because power is literally the capacity to make others do what you think is, I would say, desirable rather than what you want, but literally it is what you want. It is true that the state has that authority to compel obedience to the law, because it's the sovereign body, and the sovereign body is that which is the only and the highest law-making body. But and there are other kinds of power that it is competing with. There are other interests. There are also constitution of different kinds of power that exist in society. But in political science, we are interested also in two other kinds of questions. We make a distinction between power and legitimate authority in a democracy. So what people are by law sanctioned to do, as opposed to what an official might do in accordance by when they utilize power. So power has this element which it can be arbitrary, it can be an element both of domination and subjugation, it can be something that you actually can wield when a group of people come together to resist. That's also another kind of power. So power can also be an instrument of resistance. But there is always vis-a-vis another. So we do talk about law, we talk about legitimate authority. What a duly constituted body in accordance to the law of the land is expected to do, and what would be a violation of that. Just one other thing. I said every society has to have some arrangements for decision making. In political science, we are also concerned with some very basic questions, like why do we need a government? What if we didn't have these political arrangements? What is the purpose of law? Does law constrain my freedom, or is it an instrument which furthers and enhances my freedom? What is the best possible way of organizing society? What kind of political arrangements would be best for what purpose? So there are these, what are sometimes been called the normative dimensions. So these questions about what is good and desirable.
So would you say that that is the reason perhaps why one should be studying political science or politics? Because one of the questions that comes to, in a student's mind as well as a teacher's mind is, why study politics, Yes, there is this, you talked about how to define politics and how to understand what is political science. But then the next question immediately comes up is, then why do we have to study it? Perhaps what you're saying sort of goes into that aspect.
Well, that's certainly a part of it. But I think there is no escaping in democracy your engagement with the political. Because what happens, even if you're not party to it, let's say a bandh is called or a group decides to protest, it has an impact on what you do. It has an impact on whether you'd be able to step out into the market or go to the hospital or go for an examination, or it will be cancelled. So it has an impact on you. There is no getting away from it. So I think the point you made earlier about the question you asked about bias, I think we assume that politics is for somebody else, it's not for me, it's that messy affair. But actually we have to realize that we are part of that which is the political. And whether we act or we don't act, it has an impact and bearing
Would
on
you
us.
say, therefore, yes, that it touches on every aspect of our everyday
yeah,
living?
absolutely. And therefore, you have to try and understand it, and perhaps also find a way in which you can actually make the arrangement work in a way. And in democracy, you have that opportunity to influence it in a way that is in line with your own thinking, what you regard to be good and desirable, and to have the opportunity really to be able to persuade others that this is the better way. So I think in that sense, we need always, whether you formally study the discipline or not, to take a serious interest, in learning about the way our society, political arrangements in our society work, how decisions are taken, who's influencing what, and how do we organize ourselves in order to really make our, our own vision a part of that larger totality. And studying it formally gives us an understanding of how it's, there is this element, how have people in the past or in other societies develop these arrangements for collective decision making, so that you can really have a critical engagement with the way we are doing things. And
do you think we are adequately doing this in our country or in the classroom, as it were, in the context of university education at the undergraduate level in particular? Do you think that we are adequately engaging with the realm of these various, trying to understand these various arrangements of collectivity, as it were?
Okay, this is a difficult question because obviously the question of adequacy is a relative one. But having taught in various places now for, I don't know, almost 30 years or so, my understanding is that, as the discipline has evolved in India particularly, we have divided it into 3 subunits: political theory or philosophy, and then we have a unit called Indian politics, the study of India and politics and government and sometimes policy. And thirdly, we have this other unit called comparative politics. I think what has happened, unfortunately, is that each unit tends to be treated as a kind of hermetically sealed separate entity, because they do develop into special. Yeah, and actually, unless you see the linkages, unless you take your understanding of basic ideas about why do we need government, what do you mean by freedom, and what is it that we want the state to pursue? We want it to be just keep its hands off and let us do what we want. Is that freedom? Or is there positive content that we want it to pursue certain kinds of goals? Okay, what is freedom? So if you can take that into really saying what is our government doing now, here, what did they do previously? Have we lost some of that? Okay, how have policies
really
changed?
Going into the theory vis-a-vis the practice.
You have to build connection and then see what we are doing, that maybe these are constraints. Those were these idealistic visions, they can't be practiced, therefore we go to the comparative element. Well, are similar constraints found elsewhere? Have they devised their political institutions differently? How are they coping with?
And what are the choices?
What are the choices? How do we reorganize? Is accountability important? Is, security more important than freedom?
Do you think that also serves adequately in terms of, say, checks and balances, as it were,
I would like, ideally, if we could really build, each person could really take and draw upon the other dimension of politics and bring it into their work, so that these 3 spheres of theorizing and engaging with concepts and ideas along with practices goes hand in hand.
How central do you think is political science to the study of, if at all we want to call it the subject of social inquiry, vis-a-vis any issue that one might pick up on?
Today, indispensable. Partly because no matter what you are studying, whether you're talking about the girl child, quite obviously the existing policies that facilitate something or the other, that have an impact on whether you'll have an adverse sex ratio or not. So what the state is doing, and that has an impact, that's an overall structure you can't dispense with. All your activities, when you're expecting change, are directed in part to the state, to effect changes. Even if you want, let's say you don't want to do that, even if you want to organize yourself keeping the state aside, exactly what is the framework within which you are going to be really working and associating with each other, what is possible and not possible. All these are matters that actually political science brings an awareness of. I'm not saying this is always the exclusive domain, because there is a lot of connectivity between disciplines and we have to recognize that. So you will be learning, just political science, when it says what are the categories it should begin with, very often it may take the categories that come really from a deeper sociological analysis of your own society. Well, these are categories of gender, or caste, or religion.
Perhaps not
And
just
they're very
sociology,
important.
but also, one would probably have to go into a certain kind of a historical perspective as well.
With history and historical perspective, there's a mutual reciprocity. For such a long time, history was concerned really with the study of, what the rulers did and how they administered their polity. And only now it is expanded really to talk about a complete way of life and cultural dimensions, etc. But insofar as we have arrived at the present, from what was given to us before, history is very much part of that continuity. So, what kind of political arrangement have we arrived at in India? How were some of these basic elements, let's say, of having a federal system, or that we would have a state which is not committed to any religion?
So when you're kind of going into political science, study of politics or political science, then would that be part of the training of a student to actually first see the definition or the parameters of the discipline, and then how to move out and really go into the historical aspect, or the sociological, and to some extent also the psychological? Collective psychology would be involved in this, if not individual.
My personal feeling is, because this is a matter of pedagogy actually to some extent, my personal feeling really is that if you actually set about and tell people, okay, this is how we will link these things up, they would take note of it. But eventually, I think this is something which needs to be demonstrated to them as they do study a particular element. You could look at the notion of, the theories of democracy and the whole idea of mobs in democracy and how they distort democracy had a lot to do with the kinds of understanding of collective psychology, psychology that was coming about collective behavior in a group, in a mob, etc. that were emerging. So actually, I think one can begin with that, but we need in our teaching really all the time to draw attention to these various elements. Because almost all papers in the study, let's say when you study Indian politics or study political science, one of the papers about nationalism and colonialism, which obviously is a domain that history covers. And it could well be, but we know that we can't study how we had these political arrangements, how we arrived at our constitution, because without looking at the legacies of the national movement and the kinds of decisions that were taken of what kind of polity we will be, that we will be a group of people who will live with multiplicity of religions and culture. This was a settled fact beforehand. So you need to draw and go back and forth. And I think we need, in that sense, I think this is a kind of learning process for us as teachers. I think we need to absorb it much more. And as it were, transmit it, communicate it to the students in actual teaching.
Yeah, and I guess the learner also has to be absolutely alert on this front,
and
rather than closing one's mind to the fact that, okay, I'm doing political science, I have nothing to do with history, or with psychology. I think the intersection has to be, in a very alert fashion, realized, because I think time has come that we just don't talk about interdisciplinarity, but actually see the value for it.
I think I'm not sure how we can do this, because I agree with you entirely at one level. But I think this may have been the intention when in the old days we had something called subsidiaries you had to do, or now you call them something else, supplementary or
concurrent
courses, to make you aware of this linkages that are there. But I think what happens, as I was talking even in political science, these become compartmentalized separate wholes. And as if the beginning and end of that course has nothing really to do with the rest of what you're doing. So either those concurrent things have to be so devised that they feed in directly with the main that you're doing, and are not an encapsulated version of only the discipline, the core of those disciplines.
And one may have to use the tools of, economics to get into a study of political science at times.
All the time, and I'll tell you, and vice versa. And I'll give you one or two quick examples. We may say, when we've talked about what kinds of laws, B.T. Brinjal, which laws are emerging, and globalization and those things that you are studying, quite obviously we are thinking in terms of the way labor and capital is flowing and moving from place to place, how it is organized. And we are talking about class-based groups, organized around your mode of production, or the way the economic framework has been organized. So there is that. On the other side, they have to look at how we arrived at decisions of this kind. Why did India at a certain time agree really to a policy of liberalization? And then you go into the political dimension of what were the pressures, who took these decisions, what were the inclinations, how did they get society over on their side? Why was there so little difference of opinion at that point formally in the parliament on this issue? So there is.
Who would you sort of name as, well, you could name several, in terms of Indian political theorists or thinkers in contemporary India, right?
I think the ones who are studied now the world over and have attracted a lot of attention, even though they are not political thinkers in the classical sense, that they didn't set about writing a text which was then going to reflect on these issues, has been Mahatma Gandhi.
Mahatma Gandhi?
Without doubt. I think the single most influential person, and now I think his writings are read virtually the world over as part of political science, and on political ideas,
And from outside
world.
India?
Several, because we do study history of Western political thought very, very centrally in all our basic curriculum in political science, partly because we want to take up the way in which this whole idea of the individual and individual's relationship as a citizen in a democracy evolved, and on that there has been a lot of debate and systematic writing in the West. So there are great names that have constructed the canon down from Plato onwards, but I think in recent times it would be recent means from after 16th century. That's how I'm talking about recent. I think 2 or 3 big names that would be indispensable would be Hobbes, Rousseau, Mill.
And
Mill, John Stuart Mill,
Yeah,
John Stuart Mill, for this kind of thing.
Interesting.
But Karl Marx is a lingering influence and cannot be avoided.
Interestingly, what comes to my mind is that when you look at, say, somebody like Mahatma Gandhi, the political scientist owns him as, as a political thinker. The economist will do that for economics. The the sociologist would do that also.
True.
So interestingly, what one is really seeing is as to how for a good thinker, one has to really go holistic.
The same is true for all the classical thinkers too. Because Aristotle wrote on a variety of subjects.
Poetics.
Philosophy, poetics, you do that. In English literature, we do it in politics, we do Nicomachean ethics, which is philosophy, and then there's a lot of writing on other kinds of things, which are life sciences, etc.
In some cases, we need to go back
John Stuart
into
Mill.
history to understand this point.
John Stuart Mill, similarly, I think none of them were just professional in one discipline. The whole division of labor of this kind is a 19th century phenomenon. And so otherwise these boundaries were very, very, he wrote very extensively on the sciences, on the methods of inquiry, what constitutes a science, and wrote perhaps one of the most decisive, very brief, short thesis on what constitutes liberty, which has been a point of inspiration for generations.
Yeah, in modern history and yes, even beyond that. One of the things that comes to my mind is, Gurpreet, your own work, which is extremely interesting, particularly in the context of multiculturalism. And I am very interested in also understanding, and our students I'm quite sure are, in trying to understand how would that be seen vis-a-vis the concept of cultural diversity as it operates in our own country. How would you see the difference between, say, multiculturalism of say, Canada as compared to the cultural diversity that we talk about in our country?
One thing is that when we talk about cultural diversity, by and large, very often, not always, very often we are only using it as a descriptive category. That this is a land of so many different religions and languages and cultures, etc., etc. While when we talk about multiculturalism as a theory of politics, we are really focusing on how should we deal with the coexistence of different cultures. Does it pose a special kind of challenge and problem to the way liberal democracies functioned in the past? So they are trying to point out to some lacunas in the way liberal democracies had taken shape in the West, and want to raise this issue of why accommodating in diversity at the individual level is not sufficient, and it may continue to disadvantage some groups. Now, we may say that when we began framing our constitution, we wanted to give all these groups and communities a kind of fair treatment and a reasonably equal treatment. So we were concerned with something similar, but we didn't really articulate it or think about it in terms of what changes does it require in terms of the way we are going to organize our democracy. Okay? So I think that's essentially the difference. There are some policies which we have followed for a long time, perhaps, which are more or less the same. But the grounds and reasoning for them are different. For instance, when we say, okay, if there are a group of people who see themselves as a separate cultural entity and have lived on a particular place for a long period of time, well, we should try and accommodate them and give them some way of having some degree of relative political autonomy to organize themselves. So they had the Quebec, the French-speaking nations, and gave them a special status. They had the indigenous people whom they had colonized and wanted to set things right for them and gave them special status in reservation land. In India, we didn't have problems of that kind. Okay, we saw all these people really as people of this particular land. But when the demand for linguistic reorganization of states occurred, we actually followed a similar path. We decided really to allow linguistic communities to become governing entities here. But because we were not thinking in terms of what are the challenges that organizing, accommodating cultural diversity poses to liberal democracies, generally speaking, we were perhaps less concerned about what will be the fate of new minorities that are created within these units. This is something it's not that we didn't attend to it. We did attend to it in a way, but this is something which has remained relatively neglected.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting because you are approaching the whole question as a political scientist, and you're going from the point of view of, say, governance and what, as a system of arrangement needed to be done. I have studied cultural diversity as a student of literature in our own country, and I'm looking at literary traditions that have evolved out of this cultural diversity. And interestingly, what gets reflected then, for me, there is a need to also use the tool of political science to look at this cultural diversity, just as perhaps you may need to look at the literary expression.
One might add that actually the concept cultural diversity will push in completely different directions. I think when people talk sometimes of cultural diversity, they are talking about syncretic traditions, traditions with fluid boundaries, which have taken and absorbed each other's influences. And I think when we are talking within this framework, we are really talking about what are, things like giving equal, identical rights to everybody. Is that enough? Do we give political rights to everyone as citizens? Is that enough for equal treatment? The state has to have some medium of instruction. If it chooses one language, what is its impact upon others? So when we have policies like mother tongue teaching, and we have so many, and how do we do this? So, for political science, there are other new dimensions there.
I think the reason why we therefore need not take all this for granted, that I'm speaking English, there is that we are conversing right now in English has a politics to it. There is a history to it. And there is obviously a certain kind of status, therefore, to, assigned to those who speak in mother tongue, those who speak in English or whatever. So what I'm trying to say is that no matter what the issue, social or at the individual level, various disciplines serve their own purpose, and also not just individually gathering knowledge about why one is doing whatever, but how these disciplines need to come together to have a holistic understanding of that phenomenon. Thank you very much, Gurpreet, for throwing light on so many of these issues. And we will, of course, keep asking you to come in here over and over again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great pleasure.